Hi everyone who's joining us for the fifth in our webinar series. Please do introduce yourselves on the chat channel when you're logged on so that we know that people are actually getting in and seeing the webinar. Oops. Go on to all panelists and attendees. Okay, so I can see from the participants' numbers that people are logging on effectively, Sarah, so that's happening.
Right.
Hi, Kathy.
Oh, yes.
You can see that Kathy Ryan has joined. That's really good. Thank you for letting us know you're there, Kathy. It's always good to know that you're actually getting out into the ether properly. So I'll start my introduction so that we leave as much time as possible for Sarah to do her slides and take questions. So repeat hello to everyone joining us. Please do keep letting us know that you're there on the chat channel. I'm sure everybody does know, but for anyone here who happens not to, I'm Barbara Hammond. I'm the CEO of the Low Carbon Hub. The Low Carbon Hub is a group of social enterprises in Oxfordshire, and together we are out to prove that we can meet the UK's energy needs in a way that's good for people, particularly relevant for this webinar, and good for the planet. So this is the fifth in our series of webinars, which is really great to have got that to that number. All of them are focusing on the future of energy and the transition to a renewable energy future, with a particular focus on Project LEO. And for those of you who don't already know, Project LEO, Local Energy Oxfordshire, is a £40 million project conducting real-world trials to understand the role local energy can play in accelerating the transition to a zero carbon energy system. Had a little break since the last webinar, but if you missed any of the previous four, you'll find all of the webinar recordings on the Low Carbon Hub YouTube channel. Next week, we are welcoming Nuvei for a discussion on the role of electric vehicles in Project LEO. And there are registration details for this webinar on the Low Carbon Hub website. We'll be recording tonight's webinar, just in case anyone has a problem with that. We will be recording it for people who couldn't attend, and that will be available online later in the week. So with all of that introduction, let's get on to tonight's webinar. The topic tonight is people in smart local energy systems, some thoughts from Project LEO and beyond. And I'm really delighted to introduce our speaker, Sarah Darby. Sarah is acting leader of the Energy Programme and an associate professor at the University of Oxford Environmental Change Institute. She has a special interest in how energy systems change as a result of people interacting with technology and with each other. Her research has included evaluating the effectiveness of energy advice programmes and the British Smart Metering programme, analysing community energy projects and assessing the potential for active demand in electricity systems. Within Project LEO, Sarah is leading work package 6, which aims to capture what we learn from the project, assist with engaging stakeholders, and share knowledge gained through LEO as widely as possible from interested members of the public through to government. I've known Sarah for ages now in her role in the ECI at Oxford University, but I think this is the first project we've actually worked together on, Sarah, which is just fantastic for me, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your talk.
Thanks a lot, Barbara, and good evening, everyone. Yes, so people in smart local energy systems, putting people first, really, thinking about, this is a webinar about the whole process of rethinking what our energy systems are and what they might be. And I'm suggesting that bringing people a lot more to the fore in our thinking is going to be immensely important in moving to the sort of energy systems that I think we're all looking for, which are good for the planet and good for prosperity, and generally making a livable future for us. So first of all, some thoughts about people in energy systems, full stop, just energy systems. And then we'll move on to thinking about what a smart system might be and what the role of people might be in smart systems. And one of the first things I want to say by way of introduction is that I'm not a smart technologist. I'm a long way from being a smart technologist, and I'm coming at it from that sort of perspective. It's not that I disrespect smart technology in any way, I don't, but I'm not coming from it, giving this webinar as an expert in technology. I'm mostly interested in what that technology does for us, what the opportunities are that it opens up, and what the sort of risks are, and what happens when people meet technology. So there's a quick outline of where I'm planning to go. And we'll just start off with a quick refresher on what energy is in the first place. And one of the most widely used definitions of energy is that it's the ability to do work or cause change. So that covers an enormous number of things, from what happens when you bend down to pick something up off the floor, to what happens when a horse pulls a carriage, to what happens when some kids are using a PlayStation, to these enormous sort of engines that we revere from the Victorian age, to something here on the bottom left, where a guy in East Africa has set up a business charging mobile phones for people, and those mobile phones enable a lot of people to do work they couldn't otherwise do, running businesses in the area and managing their lives. So energy is there as something that people use. A term that some colleagues I have like the sound of is the idea of an energy slave. It's what modern energy systems, the sort of power that modern energy systems give us. So that if you think of what a slave might have done for you back in the day, you know, if you're an ancient Egyptian or whoever, it's a horrible concept, I know, but the idea that you have a slave or a servant who does work for you. Now it's reckoned that in this country, perhaps a lot of, on average, we have power from modern energy systems that does the sort of work for us that perhaps 80 slaves might have done, or 80 slaves or human servants might have done back in the day. So it gives us this enormous ability to do things, a modern energy system that we often take for granted and perhaps shouldn't. I've got an infant grandson, and by happy accident, he's been locked in with us, locked down with us for the past few months. And this morning, I saw his tiny mind being blown by the concept of what a light switch does. We just stood by the door and I pressed the switch on and off, and he heard the click, and he looked at the lights, and he looked at the switch, and he looked at me, and it was blowing his mind because it was what on earth was going on there. And that's something I do dozens of times every day and completely take for granted. But we do have this enormous power now, thanks to electricity in particular, but also other aspects of energy systems. So we'll just kick off with that and think about that in human terms. And moving on, the idea of a system in itself and what it's made up of, and what we try and pass on to our students at the Environmental Change Institute is that energy systems are made up of, they involve demand from people who are using energy to make changes. They involve physical infrastructures of supply and demand. So there's the pipes, the wires, the batteries, etc. There's also the appliances that we use. That's infrastructure of demand through which energy flows. So it's your boiler, it's your lights, your fridge, your car, all these things. But that's the hard infrastructure. There's also what you might call the soft infrastructure. So there's all the sort of rules that govern an energy system. There are the sort of standards that we put in place to make sure that our appliances are safe and more or less efficient. There are sort of the codes of practice that are drawn up for how people behave in energy systems. There are the sort of billing arrangements we have and the tariffs we're charged. There's this enormous sort of hidden infrastructure behind an energy system. And then there's what people think about the most, which are the sources of fuel and power. So that when I say I work on energy to a person I've just met, a question they're quite likely to ask is, so what's the future like? Is it going to be wind? Is it going to be nuclear? Are we going to still have fossil fuels? You know, it's mostly the sources that people tend to think about first. And of course, there are the people who take part in energy systems. And they're often invisible. If you look at diagrams of a modern energy system, even a modern renewable clean energy system, they often look something like this. There are loads of pieces of stuff or buildings connected together by wires. And that is supposed to be the system. And yet, there is so much going on in terms of activity in an energy system. So on the demand side of the system, you've got people who are using the energy to keep warm, to feed themselves, to cook, to stay clean, to stay in contact with one another, for entertainment, and to move around. And that's on the demand end. They're also buying things, maintaining things, adapting buildings, adapting their homes. They're designing, they're driving around, they're doing all these things in relation to the equipment they use. And they're also contributing to the network activity and its flexibility. And we'll come back to that a bit later. They're doing it increasingly these days by doing their own generation, because they've got shares in a wind cooperative perhaps, or they have solar panels on the roof, or perhaps they're even lucky enough, like the people of West Oxford, to be joining in micro hydro. They're storing energy, perhaps in storage heaters or water heaters, or in a battery. They may even be trading it now through peer-to-peer trading. And they may be altering their demand to help balance the network. Again, we'll come back to that. And that's not all either. They're also, at a higher level, you might say, they're designing the markets, they're designing the tariffs, they're designing the algorithms. We hear a lot increasingly about artificial intelligence in energy systems. It's worth remembering there's always a person behind that artificial intelligence, and they're building their own assumptions into the algorithms. So there's a very human factor in there as well. They're planning the infrastructure and they're operating it. All the time, we have thousands of people in this country quietly behind the scenes operating the grid, operating the local network. We very rarely hear about them or see them. And they're taking part in invention. They're working as installers. They're upgrading the systems. They're carrying out training, trading, regulating, lobbying. My point is, there's so much activity going on in an energy system, and it's all being carried out by human beings like you and me, who have varying amounts of skill and ability, and who sometimes make mistakes. And so any energy system is always going to have to allow for that sort of human error in it. There's no way around that. So we have to find ways of dealing with it as creatively as we can. And one more thing I want to add to that activity, and that I think is the really vital sense of energy and urgency that has now gone into the way people are thinking about our energy systems in connection with climate emergency. So this is Broad Street last summer. This is the citizens of Oxford out on the streets, demanding change quickly, demanding, wanting, desperately, really, the sort of change that will take us away from climate catastrophe and into a sort of livable future for the young people, you know, in their lifetimes, for those of us who are older, for our children and our grandchildren. So there is this sort of increased political urgency, and that's translating itself, we can see, into action that's being taken in councils all around the country who have declared a climate emergency, and now they have the enormous challenge of trying to work out what that means for them and what they need to do about it. And we're all involved in electricity systems, almost you might say whether we like it or not, just by the fact that we use electricity. This is a slide I rather like that shows something of what the national grid does for us. So this is a rather special day, especially for Prince William and Kate Middleton. This is the royal wedding on the 29th of April, 2011, which quite a lot of you will remember, I expect. If you look at the y-axis of this diagram, you'll see that it starts at 30,000 megawatts of demand, or 30 gigawatts. So the graph isn't quite as dramatic as it might seem at first sight, but all the same, it's quite dramatic. It shows the very rapid surges in demand and quick fall-offs in demand when the nation takes a holiday and there's a special event going on. So you can see at 8 in the morning, it's about 30.5 gigawatts is the demand, and you see it rising rapidly as people get up and go about their business. And then you see quite a rapid fall just after 10 o'clock when Princes William and Harry leave Clarence House to go to Westminster Abbey, because the nation is starting to get interested and they're stopping doing the things they normally do in order to go and watch the telly together. And then you see that demand continue to fall off really dramatically. So you lose 3 gigawatts in the space of an hour until the low point, which is when Kate Middleton arrives at the Abbey and everyone pretty much wants to see her get out of the car and see the dress and see her walk up the aisle and so on. Surprisingly, really, a lot of people seem to, a bit surprisingly to me anyway, a lot of people seem to have had enough at that point. And go back to doing other things, but the wish to watch this stays high until the marriage bit of the ceremony is over and they're declared man and wife. After that, it becomes the bishop gets into the pulpit and the service proceeds, and quite a lot of people go back to boiling the kettle, going back to their computers and their PlayStations and so on. And you see this process happening in real time through the day. And these quite dramatic falls and rises in demand as people stop what they're doing to go and watch the wedding, or they go back to what they were doing before. And that's the top line. But just as interesting to some of us is what's happening on the bottom line. And this is the national grid managing to keep us with a gold standard electricity supply while all this is going on. And they have to match the demand with the supply. So if the demand suddenly falls, they have to cut off the supply as well. They have to switch supply off so that the supply and the demand balance, and so that the frequency, which is that yellow line, stays within 50.2 and 49.8 hertz. So that's the right-hand y-axis. And it has to be done extremely swiftly and extremely skillfully. If, on the other hand, the demand suddenly rises, they've got to bring on new generation. And they have to do this within seconds. So it's a very clever process. And you see that they did, in fact, manage to do that. So we're all part of this system. Whatever we do has some impact on it. It will be a very, very small impact for us as individuals, but we're all part of it. It's a shared system. And if we think that the national grid have quite a challenge on their hands, our local distribution network sometimes has a bigger challenge, because things can change quite rapidly in a very small substation area, and that needs managing too, and that needs balancing too. And as we get new forms of demand on the system, and we also get new forms of supply, that challenge gets bigger. And it's because of that challenge that we're seeing the development of smart energy systems. And we're moving from the old system of big stations, big power stations, big transmission lines all over the country, to something that is much more networked, with lots of different forms of small scale supply being balanced out in networks in real time. And this is the sort of transformation that we're seeing underway. And the sort of mantra that often goes with this is 3 Ds. Decarbonise, we have to for the climate. Digitise, that's add IT, bring in smart energy. Decentralise, lots of forms of generation scattered around the country. And some of us would like to add a 4th D to that, democratise, so involve people in the decision making about all this. So that's kind of the big picture as I see it, and something about how I see the role of people in it. I thought I'd tell you a bit about the smart energy project I was in a few years ago. It was called RealValue, and the idea was, could you get real value for customers and for the system if you took some of the millions of storage heaters in the European Union, so distributed storage, lots and lots of small scale storage, and you used it to help balance the networks and the grid. Could you get value from that for the networks and for the customers? So we were testing out storage heating in Ireland and in Germany and in Latvia. 3 quite different situations, really. Giving people new storage heaters that were better quality than their old ones and that were smart enabled, so they had digital controls. And it was possible for the customers to set the temperatures and the timings to what they wanted. But once they'd done that, the network was free to automatically switch on and off their storage heating, so that if there was a lot of wind on the system, for example, they could use that wind energy and store it. And if they needed to switch off for very short periods to help balance the grid, they could do that too. And this project started off on a great wave of optimism. All the technology was ready, and we had 3 years to try it out on the ground with real people. And it was a very, very interesting process seeing how that worked out. So just to cut to the chase, did we actually manage to achieve this fully flexible charging with the storage heaters? And the answer is yes, but it took a lot longer than we thought it would. And even then, we weren't able to connect up all the load to make all the load available all the time. So it took over 2 years to really get this going, but we did manage it. And in fact, in Germany, the network concerned have continued to, they've kept going with this, and this is part of the way they operate their network now. One of the things we discovered was that you can have all the technology market ready, but actually connecting it up so that it works for people in the way it's meant to is extraordinarily difficult at times. So even when the pieces are ready, getting it all working as a system can be extremely difficult. We also found recruiting customers, it's not necessarily easy, and it's not easy partly for very good reasons, because you've got to be very careful about customer protection. and customer privacy and so on. So it has to be done very carefully. That it took time. We were all on a learning curve, and you've got to allow for that. And certainly that's what we're trying to allow for in Leo. We're making learning a very, an absolutely central part of the project. And we also found on the big scale that there were sometimes delays because smart meter rollouts were taking a lot longer than was expected. And the regulations, the regulatory background in terms of being able to charge the sort of tariffs we wanted, that wasn't ready either. So, big picture, those were our findings at the end in terms of system. If we then look at the customers themselves and how well it worked for them, how well did it work for them? And we found, yes, it took some, it took time and effort, but it was possible to give customers a good experience from this. And when they had a good experience, which most of them did, this was what it came from. And very conveniently, all of the words began with C, or at any rate they did once we'd finished with them. So the first one was comfort. People had new heaters. They were more efficient than the old heaters. They looked more attractive. A lot of you will know that old school storage heaters are not a pretty sight. And for the people who could understand the digital controls all right, they were more controllable. But some people did struggle rather with that.
Sarah, can I interject a question there? I think this is a really fascinating project, and this slide is particularly fascinating to me. I'm just wondering whether there was a sort of weighting in these factors, in these the 5 C's, and whether the comfort of the new kit sort of outweighed any of the other bits of experience, the sort of red bits.
I think that for most of the customers, comfort, yes, probably trumped pretty much everything else. But what we found was that the comfort was in some ways linked with the care. People, and with the control, people felt comfortable partly because they could control their heating better than they had been able to before.
Yeah.
So they were able to set the heater to say, between 9 and 11 every morning, I want 21 Celsius or whatever. And that actually improved their comfort, just the knowledge that they could control, and also the knowledge that they had some kind of backup if things went wrong. I think that was a factor too. So yeah, comfort I would say was the biggest, was the big one, but it was linked a bit to the 3 in red. Okay. So control and care, certainly. Yeah. You listened cost. Unfortunately, we weren't able to use the meter data from most of these customers, so we weren't really able the billing data. But from what we could make out, and from the billing data that we did have, we found that when customers had really got the hang of using the new heating in the way it was intended, their bills tended to fall. But we had to go a lot on just what customers told us. And a lot of customers actually thought it didn't make much difference in terms of cost, but they were more comfortable. So they were at least getting more for what they paid for. I put the bottom 3 in red because they're all about forms of communication. So the control is about people communicating with the technology. The care is about people with people, and the connectivity is about getting the technology functioning and working properly for people. So these were all crucial things from the smart trials. And as you see, they really are a mix of human factors and technology factors.
We've got a question here, Sarah, about whether there's a need for better interfaces and whether voice control like Siri or those sorts of smart in-home things that I don't know anything about because I hate them. Is that
Yeah,
needed?
I'm all for good interfaces. When it gets to Siri and some of the smart home tech, I guess my advice would be to be rather cautious about that, because it can do weird things at times, and it tends not to work quite in the ways you would expect. So some people get good experiences from using smart thermostats, but it isn't necessarily going to work to cut down on your heating use because of the way it's set up, and because of other systems you may have operating in the home at the same time. So I would say be rather cautious on that.
And we've got another question on whether there was a correlation between problems with digital control and age and or levels of educational attainment.
Yes, certainly it was the older customers who tended to have more trouble with the digital controls. And they were particularly reliant on return visits from project staff, who would not just instruct them in how to use the controls at first, but would call back 2 weeks later and say, how are you getting on? Or perhaps the housing manager in the social housing where they were would come and give them some advice, or maybe they had a neighbour upstairs who knew about these things and would help. So for them, they really needed some backup and support.
Sorry, Sarah.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
Yeah. I was just going to say, if you cast your mind back to when digital TV was introduced in this country, I mean, that was remarkably successful. And I remember my mum was well into her 80s when it was introduced, and she was in the northwest England, which was, I think, the first part of the country. And she'd been a radar operator in the war, so she was quite tech savvy, but she was struggling a bit. And she was just full of praise for the way she could call a number and be taken through very slowly and patiently what she needed to do to handle digital TV. And when we did digital TV, it was done with a lot of care to the backup. And I think that was quite a model really for introducing smart technology, and we seem to have rather forgotten the significance of that at times, perhaps, when we plan our smart technology initiatives, that for a lot of people, if it's going to work for them, you do need that sort of backup.
Yeah, and we've had another question. This example has prompted lots of activity. One from John Bassendine saying that in Northern Europe we concentrate on heating, but in Southern Europe the 5 Cs would have to relate to air conditioning, and whether there are any such air conditioning projects that have been done in the same way as smart heating.
No, but I mean, this was particularly about thermal storage. So with smart cooling, there wouldn't be an exact... I guess there could be a parallel if you were going to use excess electricity to freeze blocks of ice, for example, and then use them for cooling at other times. It's an interesting thought. As far as I know, nothing like that quite has been done.
Yeah, because the sort of thermal mass question.
Yeah, well, that's right. Yeah.
And then we've got a final one, which I think is echoed by a lot of people, from Peter Thompson, saying that many of us seem to have had such a bad experience with the installation and benefits brackets not of the smart meter rollout, that we're bound to be pretty cynical about any other new technology.
Right. Okay. It's interesting to hear that one, because my take on what I've seen of the smart meter rollout is that there are lots of criticisms you can make of it, but that on the whole, in social terms, it's actually worked out better than it has in a lot of countries. So clearly, a bit of controversy there.
Be quite good to get some of that information back out to people, I think, Sarah, but maybe we can take that off
Yeah,
because that's news to me as well.
yeah.
And then finally, and then we'll let you move on.
Yeah,
Paul Fair is saying that there were some tangible benefits to digital TV that people could really relate to.
yeah.
And so it's a question of really being clear with people. And he's saying he's not sure whether people understand how smart meters can really benefit them. And there's a I'm just adding my own comment here, just to be clear, that I think there's a feeling that the smart meters sort of benefit the supplier rather than the householder, maybe.
Yeah, and of course, well, it's the network operator that the smart meter benefits in terms of the energy industry. It's the network operator who gets most of the benefit from it. The supplier is really just marketing and selling you the kilowatt hours. Yes, so part of, I guess, as with the smart thermal storage, what the aim is that you get a benefit for the customer and you get a benefit for the system. And the way it was designed in this country, and we are very unusual in that, is that it's not just about the smart meter. This is a thing I bang on about quite often, but it was and is a threefold program, that you have a smart meter, that everyone who has a smart meter is offered a well-designed in-home display, so they've got an interface and they can see what's going on. And you've also got a trained installer. So all the smart meter installers, they have quite a comprehensive code of practice. They're all to be trained, not just to install a piece of kit, but to talk with the customers, if their customers want to talk about it, to tell the customers what the smart meter can and can't do for them, and how to use the in-home display. And they're also trained to offer basic energy advice. So it is this threefold thing. And before the smart meter rollout, there were some large-scale trials carried out between 2007 2010 by 4 of the big suppliers. And only one of those sets of trials showed no sort of benefits to the customers in terms of the customers feeling things had got better for them, or they were saving energy and so on. And that was the supplier who just put in smart meters. They just tell the customers, we're replacing your meter. They didn't tell them anything about what it might be able to do for them. And the other 3 trials did show that, you know, on average, small benefits to the customers. And those averages concealed a wide range of outcomes, really, but so that the smart meter and the display and so on work very well indeed for some people and less so for others. But it's terribly important to remember there's nothing magic about a smart meter. Just having one isn't going to bring down your bills unless you can use it in such a way as to help you do so.
Cool. Thanks, Sarah. We'll let you get on now.
Okay, right. Okay, so this is a real meta graph that you're seeing here. This involves data from hundreds of thousands of customers mostly in Europe and North America, brought together in one place. But it's looking at what happens when you do improve the feedback to householders through in some way or other. So you're giving them more accurate bills because they've got automated meter reading, and you're giving them, and they have in-home displays to help them understand what's going on. And you see, what you see is quite interesting for electricity. You see how there's what you might expect, really, which is that at first, yes, there are savings, and then they dip down after a few months. And, you know, it's a phenomenon we're quite familiar with, that your display seems very interesting at first, and then you get a bit bored with it. But what's interesting is that if you carry on after that, the level of savings goes up. And I think we've got two things at play here. And the second of those is that some new habits may be taking shape, but also once time goes on, you start buying new things. And there seems to have been something that's happened to people's awareness, so that they're more likely to buy more efficient appliances, for example, as time goes on, than the people who don't have smart meters. And with gas, you can see quite dramatic impact there, which you could put down to people having a much better feel for how their heating bill varies with time, more accurate billing, and a better understanding, and realizing the importance of home insulation and getting more efficient boilers happening. So as I say, this is data from huge numbers averaged out, but showing this interesting feature of how people respond over periods of time and what sort of savings they get on average.
Yeah, Sarah, I've always had this sort of feeling that anecdotally I've got evidence for, but not this sort of wonderful data that you've got here, that if people buy PV, the same sort of thing starts happening, that they sort of want to make the most of it.
Yeah.
And so they start investing in other things to make
Yes.
Have you seen any studies around that, properly academically done?
Well, the one I did myself in Launton, near Bicester, about 20 years ago, there I was interested in, I was following up what happened. I was trying to bring together what people were doing in terms of energy efficiency in their homes, you know, what sort of, whether they were the kind of people who were dead keen on DIY, and so they were really interested in how their homes worked and altering their homes, and did they have, at that point it was solar water heating. This was really before solar PV kicked off, but in a big way, but you know, did they have solar water heating, or were they interested in it? And you found this sort of combination of things going on, that yes, people who were interested in the new technology and interested in renewables, they were more likely to be interested in energy efficiency. They were more likely to be doing things to their home to improve the energy efficiency and so on. They were more likely to be talking to other people about it. All these things sort of came together. So yeah, I'd agree with you. I think once people start to feel that they're part of an energy system, and they're actors, you know, they're not just the person who pays the bills, then you do see this learning taking place over time. And you see it actually paying out in terms of activity, in terms of consumption. And I guess it's worth just saying for the record too, that just reminding people that electricity and gas consumption have both been falling in this country over the past 15 years, although the population has been going up and although the number of households has been going up. And part of that story, I think, is the rising awareness, as well as part of the story being improvements in energy efficiency. Okay, oh, time's going on. So now coming to LEO itself and local energy. So this idea of a smart local energy system, or a SLES, which is the rather ugly acronym for it. This is quite a new kid on the block, and there isn't a fixed definition of it yet. But when I was asking LEO partners what they think a local energy system is, they were saying things like, it's smart if it involves IT, as we've had before, and if it involves some automation. But they were also keen to say, you know, to acknowledge that actually the technology is as smart as the people behind it. You know, just having IT doesn't guarantee success. It's smart if it makes what's going on in the system more visible, so that the poor network operator who has this immense challenge of bringing us a wonderful electricity supply, you know, if they know what's going on in terms of microgeneration and storage and demand, that makes the system a lot smarter. It makes it possible to make the very best use of local resources and to use them locally, so that they don't have to be fed into the transmission grid and then back again. It's also smart if it involves new ways of thinking about energy use, and we are in the middle of this really exciting process of rethinking what energy use might be in a transformed energy system. And it also involves new ways of thinking about how you set up the system and how you operate it. And it's local. If it involves local organisations, local communities, and really involves them. So, you know, not just as consumers, but as people who are active in the system. And this really interesting idea that I think we attribute to the Low Carbon Hub, Barbara, you know, that it's managed from the edge. So it's managed from the outside. So all of us who are, as it were, on the edge of the grid, the management starts there in very small ways, and that if we can solve problems around the edge, that also makes things easier in management from the centre.
There's a point here from one of our participants about David Alscott about the impact of social media and whether that's going to be have an impact in spreading this through communities by targeting social media influencers.
Yeah, I think it very well could. I mean, I've one colleague who teamed up with Robert Llewellyn, and they did a video together about electric vehicles and Tesla storage. It went viral. It had over 1 million hits. I mean, it's certainly done his business no harm. And it's certainly, you know, which is also good for solar PV generally and the industry. So yeah.
Cool.
It can work both ways, of course, social media.
Yeah.
I like any other, but the scary thing about social media is the speed at which it happens. When Leo started, one of the main insights was that demand isn't something that we should anymore just take for granted as general aggregate load. It's something that can be flexible, that can be used in managing the system much more imaginatively than we have done in the past. So it started from that. That's the yellow star there, the sort of flash of insight. In terms of how we're going to make a local energy system work well, what you see down the left-hand side of that slide are our first attempts of thinking about all this. And you can see it's very much in terms of quite general terms: use big data, change supply to meet demand, to balance the network, and use up the energy locally as much as you can to take pressure off the substation and you know, the series of points through which electricity passes if it's moving outwards into the world. So really quite basic principles then. And this is the most complex slide you're going to see, you'll be relieved to hear. There's rather a lot on it. So I've still kept in the white writing down the left-hand side, but I've chucked in a whole lot more once we'd really started developing these ideas. So we're not just talking in these general sort of terms about data and energy, we're talking about business models, we're talking about developing a coalition of the willing, lots of willing actors. And one of the main reasons we got funding for this project in the first place was because there are already so many willing actors in Oxfordshire who are willing to, you know, who are keen to take part in this, and building networks of engaged people and developing software platforms that they can use to trade and to support the network, and also, of course, to get their own energy services in a way that works for them. So we're not just building an energy system here, it's also, the aim is to build a system that has social benefits as well, that helps with community, and that also helps build up knowledge and skills in the county and beyond it. So as you see, this is rather a messy sort of diagram. I expect by the time we get to Leo, the end of Leo, we'll have something a bit more elegant, but this is the work in progress. And I think this is my last slide. I'll leave you with, but these are some of the main challenges that we've encountered so far. And you'll see that they are all, because of the way I come at this, I've tended to highlight the human challenges, but they are all central to what we're doing. I particularly pick on the middle one, the developing and operating an inclusive system, because the energy system is changing a lot, and it's going to become increasingly important who owns and who manages the different assets within it. And if you don't have easy access to these sorts of assets, then clearly there's a danger that people get left behind in a new smart energy system. So bearing that in mind, this is really one of the central concerns, I think, of the project, that nobody gets left behind in this.
It's been quite interesting in the first, looking at all of these together, Sarah, how, because it's such a huge project and the amount of momentum we've needed to get the rock rolling, it's taken quite a long time for us really to start talking to each other a lot across all the work packages.
Yes.
And I just think that first one is just so right,
yes.
About how much we need to do that.
Yes, and in fact we have a monthly meeting with we have a lot of public funding for this, and so we have to be accountable for it, and we are monitored closely by two people, two monitors every month. So we have a big meeting every month when we have to report back on where we're getting to, and of course it also serves as a place where we're reporting to each other as well. And at times, you know, this feels quite burdensome, because it seems as though you're no sooner through with one monthly meeting than you're preparing for the next. But it does help us to some extent, I think, in terms of keeping in touch with each other and just trying to learn to speak roughly the same language about what we're trying to do. And so far, you know, broadly, it's going well, I think. I don't think there's anyone in this project who wouldn't say they haven't learned an enormous amount over the last year.
Yeah, and we've got a comment very much agreeing on that inclusiveness point. And what was really great for me from the stakeholder advisory board meeting we had on Project Leo this morning was to really hear big techie bits of the system like Ofgem and Elexon,
yeah,
saying with not just lip service, but following up with how can we act on this?
Yes, yeah.
I thought we're starting to chip away at that. It's a socio-technical system with the socio coming first.
Yes, yeah. Yes, it's, yeah, I agree. It was very encouraging, that. And yes, that's another aspect of the project, that we do have a stakeholder advisory board, and we do have people from government and from the regulator on that, as well as from Community Energy England and other bodies. So there is a sort of, there is a pathway to policymakers that way to try and pass on what we're learning. And they are really interested, because it's very clear that the old sorts of energy system have had their day. And yeah, to be part of trying to build a new one within the while keeping the old one going, it's an extraordinary process, because we're not doing this in some sort of protected experiment. No. Scottish and Southern electricity networks, they have to keep the system going just as they always have, while we are carrying out experiments within that. So it's an enormous challenge for them doing that.
Yeah, it is. And that little issue we've just had about the difference between constrained and constraint
yes.
was quite interesting for the people listening. We'd been gaily going around saying how fantastic it was doing this in Oxfordshire, because the grid is constrained right across the county, and it makes electricity engineers blench, because constrained means that the whole thing's gone black and you're not actually getting electricity to anyone. So we've really got to get the language right so that everybody understands.
Yes, for them that's a total nightmare. Yes, yeah.
But the difference is really not clear to real people. There's one question that I'm skipped over a little earlier, Sarah, to let you get through your slides. It was from Alan Barlow, and he was wondering whether there's a problem with smart meters not being standardized.
Not that I'm aware of, but I think you'd have to go to someone with more technical expertise than I have on smart meters to know about that.
Okay, I think he's probably thinking about the differences between SMETS 1 and SMETS 2. But
yeah, okay, yes. I mean, there is a functional specification that they all have to meet, but certainly the first generation of smart meters, you couldn't, for example, switch supplier with them. So a lot of people, if they did switch supplier, they found that their smart meter wasn't operating in smart mode anymore, which was obviously pretty disappointing.
And we've got a question here about whether Leo is looking at how communities can aggregate their generation and supply it locally without having to give away lots of value to the wider network.
Well, yes, we are going to be. And I guess you are already, Barbara, via summer.
Yeah, we are. There's a big difference here between the energy bit and the flexibility bit that Leo is more about, and how the regulation allows you to do both of those things. And it's actually more difficult to be trading energy in that way. Some people might be aware of the Octopus Agile app, but that's not really trading the actual energy. It's a sort of secondary proxy sort of system. And it'll be interesting to see how those things all develop, I think. But yeah, we'd love to do some of the energy alongside the flexibility services, so that we're really getting an understanding of peer-to-peer behind the secondary substation. That would be fantastic if we can get there. Slightly worry whether we will or not.
It starts to get very fiddly when you get to peer-to-peer.
It does, absolutely does.
Yeah.
Just because of the way that the regulatory system is set up. But yeah, hopefully we will do a little bit of that in one or two of the trials. If there are no more questions, I think that is our allotted hour complete. Just had a very nice many thanks for the presentation from Bruce, who is my next door neighbour. So Bruce, growing these energy communities bit by bit, Sarah. So, and Zoe has just reminded everybody of where we can find the registrations for the upcoming webinars, and lots of really lovely comments coming in, Sarah. So thank you very much for that.
Okay. Well, you're welcome.